The morning sun cast long shadows through the glass windows of Fast Track Logistics headquarters as Sarah Chen stared at the quarterly report on her desk. At 35, she was the youngest CEO in the company's history, and something about these numbers bothered her deeply. Sarah ran her fingers through her straight black hair, a habit she developed during her decade-long climb up the corporate ladder. The financial reports showed record profits, but the customer satisfaction scores were dropping month after month. Even more troubling was the spike in employee resignations across their nationwide network of warehouses and delivery centers. "Ms. Chen, your 9 a.m. meeting is about to start," her assistant Thomas announced through the intercom. Sarah gathered her papers, straightened her navy blazer, and headed to the conference room. The board members were already seated, mostly older men in expensive suits who had initially doubted her ability to lead when she was appointed CEO 6 months ago. Sarah had proved them wrong by increasing profits by 15% in her first quarter, but that victory now felt hollow. "Our numbers are strong," Sarah began, clicking through her presentation, "but I'm seeing some concerning patterns in our operational data." She pulled up a graph showing employee turnover rates. "We're losing experienced drivers at an alarming rate. Our training costs have doubled." Richard Maxwell, the head of operations, cleared his throat. "With all due respect, Ms. Chen, turnover is normal in the delivery industry. These numbers are within acceptable limits." Sarah's eyes narrowed. "Are they? Because our customer complaints have increased by 40% in the same period." She clicked to the next slide, revealing a chart of delayed deliveries and damaged packages. The room grew tense. Board members exchanged uncomfortable glances. "Perhaps we should focus on the positives," suggested Janet Morris, the chief financial officer. "Our profit margins are at an all-time high. Shareholders are happy." But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was fundamentally wrong. After the meeting, she returned to her office and began digging deeper into the company records. Fast Track Logistics had grown from a small regional delivery service to a national corporation in just 15 years. They now employed over 10,000 people across the country, with 5,000 delivery drivers serving millions of customers. As she reviewed employee feedback forms, a pattern emerged. Drivers complained about unrealistic delivery quotas, faulty equipment, and hostile management. But these complaints seemed to disappear before reaching the corporate level. Sarah thought about her own journey. She'd started as an entry-level analyst, working her way up through marketing, operations, and finally to the CEO position. But she'd never worked on the front lines. She'd never experienced what their drivers dealt with daily. That evening, as she stood by her office window overlooking the city, an idea began to form. It was risky, possibly crazy, but it might be the only way to understand what was really happening in her company. Sarah opened her laptop and began researching. She found that several major corporations had executives who'd gone undercover to learn about their companies, but none had attempted what she was planning, to actually work as a delivery driver across multiple locations. She called Thomas into her office. "I need you to help me with something, but it has to remain absolutely confidential." Thomas, who had been her assistant for 3 years, nodded seriously. "Of course, Ms. Chen." "I'm going undercover as a delivery driver," she announced. "I need you to help me create a new identity and arrange for me to work at different Fast Track locations around the country." Thomas's eyes widened, but he quickly regained his composure. "How long would this operation last?" "1 month," Sarah replied. "I'll need to visit at least 4 different facilities to get a clear picture." She paused, considering the implications. "The board can't know about this. We'll tell them I'm taking a working vacation to visit our international partners." As they began planning the details, Sarah felt a mix of excitement and apprehension. She would need to change her appearance, create a believable backstory, and learn to drive a delivery van. More importantly, she would need to navigate the daily challenges faced by their drivers without revealing her true identity. What she didn't know was that this decision would uncover secrets far more shocking than she could imagine, and put her in situations that no CEO training could have prepared her for. The truth about Fast Track Logistics was about to be exposed, one delivery at a time. Sarah Chen sat in her spacious apartment, staring at the driver's uniform laid out on her bed. After 2 weeks of careful planning, everything was ready for her undercover mission. Thomas had helped her create a new identity, Sarah Lee, a former retail worker looking for a fresh start. They had chosen to use her maiden name to minimize the risk of discovery. Her designer clothes were replaced with simple jeans and t-shirts, her expensive watch swapped for a basic fitness tracker, and her sleek corporate hairstyle transformed into a casual ponytail. "The first placement is arranged," Thomas explained, handing her a folder. "You'll start at our Chicago facility next week. I've rented a small apartment in the area under your new name." Sarah flipped through the documents. Her new driver's license, social security card, and work history all seemed authentic. Thomas had done an impressive job creating her cover story. "What about the board?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "They believe you're in Singapore, exploring potential partnerships. I've scheduled virtual meetings that I'll handle with pre-recorded messages and updates." Thomas paused. "Are you sure about this, Miss Chen? It's risky." Sarah walked to her window, looking out at the city lights. "Something's wrong with my company, Thomas. The numbers look good on paper, but we're losing good people. Our customers are unhappy. I need to know why." That night, Sarah practiced driving the delivery van in an empty parking lot. The vehicle was larger than anything she'd driven before, and she needed to master it before starting her assignment. After 3 hours of practicing turns, reverse parking, and loading procedures, her arms ached, and she had a new respect for their drivers. The next morning, she stood in front of her bathroom mirror, applying the finishing touches to her transformation. Gone were her designer makeup and perfectly styled hair. The woman staring back at her looked ordinary, forgettable, exactly what she needed. Sarah packed a small suitcase with basic clothes and necessities. She had decided to leave behind all her luxury items, keeping only a burner phone for emergencies and a secure laptop to maintain minimal contact with Thomas. As her private car drove her to the airport, Sarah reviewed the training materials for new drivers. The official manual painted a picture of an efficient, supportive workplace, but the rising number of resignations told a different story. During the flight to Chicago, Sarah sat in economy class, another first in many years. She observed her fellow passengers, trying to adopt their mannerisms and behavior. A CEO stood out by nature of their confidence and authority. She needed to learn to blend in. Her new apartment in Chicago was small and sparsely furnished, a far cry from her luxury penthouse, but it was similar to what a new driver might afford. Sarah spent the evening memorizing her cover story. She had moved to Chicago for a fresh start after working retail in Minneapolis. She was single, had no children, and lived alone. The night before her first day, Sarah received a text from Thomas. "Final check complete. Your identity is secure. Good luck." She lay in the creaky bed, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of her working-class neighborhood. Tomorrow, she would begin work at Fast Track's busiest distribution center. The facility processed thousands of packages daily and had one of the highest turnover rates in the company. Sarah reviewed her goals one last time. She needed to understand why drivers were quitting, why complaints were increasing, and what was happening to all those negative reports that never seemed to reach corporate headquarters. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was an automated message from Fast Track HR. "Welcome to the team. Report to the Chicago Distribution Center at 5 a.m. for orientation." 5 a.m. Sarah set her alarm, knowing she was about to experience the true meaning of early shift. As she drifted off to sleep, she thought about the thousands of drivers who did this job every day, keeping her company running while she sat in her comfortable office. What she didn't know was that her first day would reveal more than just tough working conditions. Hidden beneath the surface of Fast Track's daily operations was a system of corruption that would shock even her cynical corporate mind. The truth was about to unfold, one delivery at a time, and Sarah Chen was about to discover just how deep the problems went. Sarah's next assignment took her to Fast Track's Detroit facility. After saying goodbye to Maya and the Chicago team, she arrived at a warehouse that made her previous location look well managed by comparison. Her first red flag appeared during orientation. Instead of receiving proper training, she was handed a stack of pre-signed safety forms. "Just file these," her new supervisor, Keith Barnes, said with a smirk. "Save us both some time." Looking through the papers later, Sarah was horrified. There were completed vehicle inspection forms for the entire month, already signed and dated for days that hadn't even happened yet. During her second day, while sorting packages in the warehouse, Sarah overheard Keith arguing with the maintenance supervisor. "I don't care if the brakes are shot," Keith snapped. "Corporate's breathing down my neck about costs. Mark it as inspected and get it back on the road." Sarah carefully noted the van number, 483, and watched as it was sent out with a rookie driver later that day. Her hands shook as she typed the details into her secure laptop that night. The following week, while filing end-of-day reports, Sarah discovered something even more disturbing. There were two sets of records: the official safety logs sent to corporate headquarters and the actual maintenance records kept by the garage staff. The differences were staggering. Failed brake inspections were logged as passed. Accidents were categorized as minor incidents. Driver injuries were completely absent from the official records. Sarah took photos of both sets of documents with her hidden phone. She knew this was evidence of serious fraud, possibly criminal negligence, but she needed to understand how high up the deception went. Her chance came during a regional manager's video conference. Sarah volunteered to help set up the equipment in the office, allowing her to listen while pretending to fix a connection issue. "Corporate's sending auditors next month," Keith announced to his fellow managers. "You know the drill. Clean up those maintenance logs. I got a template for the safety reports. Make sure your numbers match the targets." One manager spoke up. "We had 2 serious accidents last quarter. We can't hide those." "Reclassify them," Keith replied. "Make them driver error. Corporate doesn't check if we fire the drivers first. Speaking of which, anyone with high maintenance costs needs to go. Find a reason." Sarah thought about Maya and her fellow drivers in Chicago. How many good workers had been fired to cover up unsafe conditions? How many accidents could have been prevented? That evening, while processing delivery records, Sarah noticed another pattern. The system regularly marked Premium Express deliveries as standard shipping after they were delivered. The price difference went somewhere, but not to the drivers who handled those packages. She was making copies of these records when Jenny, a young office clerk, caught her. "Be careful with those," Jenny whispered, looking nervous. "Last person who asked too many questions about the shipping classifications disappeared real quick." Sarah tried to appear casual. "I'm just trying to understand the system." Jenny glanced around before speaking again. "Look, everyone knows it's happening. The managers get bonuses based on delivery costs. Lower costs mean bigger bonuses. So they adjust things." That night, Sarah sent an encrypted message to Thomas. "Need complete audit of Detroit facility. Focus on maintenance records, accident reports, and shipping classifications. Warning: they're preparing to falsify records for corporate audit." As she lay in her rented room, Sarah thought about all the lives at risk because of these falsified safety records. One brake failure, one overworked driver, one poorly maintained van. Any of these could lead to tragedy. She had the evidence of systematic fraud now, but something told her this wasn't the end. The corruption seemed too organized, too widespread to be the work of a few regional managers. The next morning, Sarah noticed Keith watching her closely as she filed papers. Had Jenny said something? Had she been too obvious in her investigations? She would have to be more careful, but she also knew she couldn't stop now. Somewhere in these papers was the link that would expose the entire operation. She just had to find it before someone realized who she really was. What Sarah didn't know was that her own identity was about to be compromised, putting everything she discovered, and everyone who had helped her, at risk. After 2 weeks in Chicago, Sarah had earned Maya's trust. The two women often shared their short lunch breaks together, and it was during one of these conversations that Maya revealed something that would change everything. "You seem different from the other new hires," Maya said, studying Sarah carefully. "You notice things. You ask questions." She glanced around the empty break room before lowering her voice. "There's something you should see." That evening, Maya invited Sarah to her small apartment. While her 2 children worked on homework in the next room, Maya pulled out a worn notebook filled with detailed records: dates, times, delivery numbers, and payment discrepancies. "I've been tracking the irregularities for months," Maya explained. "Look at these payslips." She spread several documents across her kitchen table. "The system regularly undercounts our deliveries. When we complain, they blame computer errors. But it's not random. It always shortchanges us." Sarah had examined the papers, her CEO's mind quickly calculating the scale of the fraud. If this was happening across all facilities, the company was stealing millions in wages from its drivers. "Why haven't you reported this?" Sarah asked, though she already suspected the answer. Maya laughed bitterly. "To whom? HR is in on it. Corporate never responds, and the few drivers who pushed too hard about it." She paused. "Let's just say they found themselves assigned to impossible routes until they quit." Over the next few days, Sarah discovered she wasn't the only driver Maya had confided in. There was an informal network of workers who shared information and helped each other cope with the systemic abuse. James, the injured driver from her first week, was part of this group. His injury had worsened, but he couldn't afford to stop working. The group had pooled money to help him get medical care since management had never filed his injury report. "We look out for each other," explained Rita, another veteran driver, during a secret meeting in Maya's apartment. "We warn new drivers about dangerous routes, share tips about which managers to avoid, and keep records of everything." Sarah learned that the drivers had compiled evidence of numerous violations: falsified safety records, manipulated timesheets, denied overtime pay, and dangerous vehicle conditions. But they felt powerless to act against a company with deep pockets and expensive lawyers. The situation became personal when Maya showed up to work with red eyes one morning. Her younger son had been sick, but she couldn't take time off to care for him. "They threatened to fire me if I missed another shift," she explained. "Single mom, 2 kids, rent due next week. They know I can't risk it." That night, Sarah sent a carefully worded message to Thomas. "Need comprehensive audit of payroll systems across all facilities. Priority, confidential. No involvement from regional managers." The next day, while helping Maya load her van, Sarah noticed Mike Peterson having an intense conversation with someone on the phone. "I don't care what the maintenance logs say," he was saying. "Get those vans on the road. We're not missing targets because of some stupid safety regulations." Sarah took detailed notes about everything she observed. The wage theft was bad enough, but the disregard for driver safety was criminal. She thought about Maya's children, waiting at home for their mother, and all the other families depending on these drivers returning home safely each day. Through Maya's network, Sarah learned that similar practices existed at other fast-track facilities. The Chicago operation wasn't unique. It was part of a larger pattern of exploitation. "Sometimes I dream about exposing it all," Maya confided one evening. "But who would believe us? We're just delivery drivers." Sarah felt the weight of her secret identity more heavily than ever. She wanted to tell Maya who she really was, to promise that changes would come. But she knew she needed more evidence, needed to understand the full scope of the corruption before she could act. As she prepared to move to her next location, Sarah made a silent promise to Maya and all the other drivers. This wasn't just about investigating company problems anymore. It was about justice for the people who kept Fast Track running while being systematically exploited by those in power. What Sarah didn't know was that her next assignment would reveal an even darker side of Fast Track's operations, one that would put her own safety at risk. Sarah's next assignment took her to Fast Track's Detroit facility. After saying goodbye to Maya and the Chicago team, she arrived at a warehouse that made her previous location look well managed by comparison. Her first red flag appeared during orientation. Instead of receiving proper training, she was handed a stack of pre-signed safety forms. "Just file these," her new supervisor, Keith Barnes, said with a smirk. "Save us both some time." Looking through the papers later, Sarah was horrified. There were completed vehicle inspection forms for the entire month, already signed and dated for days that hadn't even happened yet. During her second day, while sorting packages in the warehouse, Sarah overheard Keith arguing with the maintenance supervisor. "I don't care if the brakes are shot," Keith snapped. "Corporate's breathing down my neck about costs. Mark it as inspected and get it back on the road." Sarah carefully noted the van number, 483, and watched as it was sent out with a rookie driver later that day. Her hands shook as she typed the details into her secure laptop that night. The following week, while filing end-of-day reports, Sarah discovered something even more disturbing. There were 2 sets of records: the official safety logs sent to corporate headquarters and the actual maintenance records kept by the garage staff. The differences were staggering. Failed brake inspections were logged as passed. Accidents were categorized as minor incidents. Driver injuries were completely absent from the official records. Sarah took photos of both sets of documents with her hidden phone. She knew this was evidence of serious fraud, possibly criminal negligence, but she needed to understand how high up the deception went. Her chance came during a regional manager's video conference. Sarah volunteered to help set up the equipment in the office, allowing her to listen while pretending to fix a connection issue. Corporate's sending auditors next month, Keith announced to his fellow managers. You know the drill. Clean up those maintenance logs. I got a template for the safety reports. Make sure your numbers match the targets. One manager spoke up. We had 2 serious accidents last quarter. We can't hide those. Reclassify them, Keith replied. Make them driver error. Corporate doesn't check if we fire the drivers first. Speaking of which, anyone with high maintenance costs needs to go. Find a reason. Sarah thought about Maya and her fellow drivers in Chicago. How many good workers had been fired to cover up unsafe conditions? How many accidents could have been prevented? That evening, while processing delivery records, Sarah noticed another pattern. The system regularly marked Premium Express deliveries as standard shipping after they were delivered. The price difference went somewhere, but not to the drivers who handled those packages. She was making copies of these records when Jenny, a young office clerk, caught her. Be careful with those, Jenny whispered, looking nervous. Last person who asked too many questions about the shipping classifications disappeared real quick. Sarah tried to appear casual. I'm just trying to understand the system. Jenny glanced around before speaking again. Look, everyone knows it's happening. The managers get bonuses based on delivery costs. Lower costs mean bigger bonuses. So they adjust things. That night, Sarah sent an encrypted message to Thomas. Need complete audit of Detroit facility. Focus on maintenance records, accident reports, and shipping classifications. Warning, they're preparing to falsify records for corporate audit. As she lay in her rented room, Sarah thought about all the lives at risk because of these falsified safety records. One brake failure, one overworked driver, one poorly maintained van. Any of these could lead to tragedy. She had the evidence of systematic fraud now, but something told her this wasn't the end. The corruption seemed too organized, too widespread to be the work of a few regional managers. The next morning, Sarah noticed Keith watching her closely as she filed papers. Had Jenny said something? Had she been too obvious in her investigations? She would have to be more careful, but she also knew she couldn't stop now. Somewhere in these papers was the link that would expose the entire operation. She just had to find it before someone realized who she really was. What Sarah didn't know was that her own identity was about to be compromised, putting everything she discovered, and everyone who had helped her, at risk. The accident happened on a rainy Tuesday morning. Sarah was sorting packages when she heard the commotion outside the warehouse. A fast-track delivery van, number 483, the one with the faulty brakes, had crashed into a guardrail on the highway. The driver, Eric Thompson, was rushed to the hospital with serious injuries. Sarah recognized him as the rookie who had been assigned the van despite its known brake problems. Keith immediately called an emergency meeting. Listen up, he announced to the supervisors. The official story is driver error. Eric was going too fast in bad weather. Stick to that story if anyone asks. Sarah watched in disgust as Keith pulled out a blank inspection form and began filling it in with false information. See? Van passed all safety checks last week. Brakes were perfect. But this time, someone spoke up. Jenny, the office clerk who had warned Sarah earlier, stood up with shaking hands. That's not true, she said. I filed the real maintenance reports. Those brakes failed inspection 3 times. Keith's face turned red. Maybe you need to remember who signs your paycheck, Jenny. Maybe you need to remember this is someone's life we're talking about, Jenny shot back, though her voice trembled. Sarah couldn't stay silent anymore. Jenny's right, she said, stepping forward. I've seen the real maintenance logs too. The room went silent. Keith stared at them both, his expression dangerous. Both of you, in my office, now. But before they could move, Thomas suddenly appeared at the warehouse entrance, flanked by 2 corporate security officers. Sarah had sent him an emergency signal as soon as she heard about the accident. "Mr. Barnes," Thomas announced formally, "I'm here to conduct an immediate facility audit. Please step away from those records." Keith's face went pale. "This is a regional matter. You have no authority." "Actually," Sarah said, finally dropping her fake identity, "he does. By my authority as CEO of Fast Track Logistics." The shock in the room was palpable. Jenny gasped. Keith's mouth opened and closed without sound. Sarah turned to the security officers. "Secure all records. Nothing leaves this building. And get someone to the hospital. Make sure Eric Thompson receives the best care possible." She faced Keith again. "The brake problems were documented. You knew that van wasn't safe. You put profits ahead of people's lives." Keith found his voice. "You can't prove anything. Those records could have been altered by anyone." "Actually," Jenny spoke up, her confidence growing, "I kept copies. Of everything. Every falsified report, every covered-up accident, every forged inspection. I've been sending them to myself for months." Sarah looked at the young clerk with newfound respect. "Jenny, how would you like a promotion? Our corporate compliance department needs someone with your attention to detail." The next few hours were a blur of activity. More corporate officers arrived. Records were seized. Statements were taken. Keith and several other managers were escorted from the building. Sarah visited Eric in the hospital that evening. His injuries were serious, but not life-threatening. His family was there, including his pregnant wife, who broke down crying when Sarah promised that Fast Track would cover all medical expenses and continue his salary during recovery. Later that night, Sarah sat in her hotel room, looking at the evidence they gathered. The scope of the corruption was staggering. But what haunted her most was how close they'd come to real tragedy. Her phone buzzed with a message from Maya in Chicago. "Just heard what happened in Detroit. Is it true about you being CEO?" Sarah stared at the message for a long time before replying, "Yes, and I need your help to fix this company. All of it." She had promised herself she would visit all 4 facilities, but the accident had forced her hand. Now she had to move fast to prevent any more drivers from being put at risk. What she didn't know was that the next few days would bring an even bigger challenge, convincing the board to support the massive changes needed to transform Fast Track's culture. The real battle was just beginning. The Fast Track Logistics boardroom was unusually full that morning. Sarah Chen stood at the head of the table, facing not just the board members but also a group of drivers, including Maya Rodriguez from Chicago and Jenny from Detroit. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sarah began, "for the past month, I've worked undercover as a delivery driver in our facilities. What I discovered was not just mismanagement, but systematic corruption that put our workers' lives at risk." She clicked through slides showing the evidence. Falsified maintenance records, manipulated payroll data, covered-up accidents, and forged safety inspections. Richard Maxwell, the head of operations, interrupted. "This is preposterous. You can't possibly verify." "Actually, we can." Thomas stepped forward, distributing thick folders to each board member. "Every document has been authenticated. Every incident verified. And Mr. Maxwell, we have emails from your office directing regional managers to falsify reports." Maxwell's face turned red. "This is a witch hunt." "No," Maya spoke up, her voice strong despite her nervousness. "This is the truth we've been trying to tell for years. We have drivers working injured because they can't afford to take time off. Vans with failing brakes still on the road. Payment systems that consistently underpay us." Janet Morris, the CFO, shuffled through the papers. "These profit margins, they were all artificial. Built on wage theft and dangerous cost-cutting," Sarah confirmed. "The real numbers are in those folders, along with the estimated cost of lawsuits we'll face if we don't fix this immediately." Several board members whispered among themselves. Sarah could see the shock and concern on their faces as they reviewed the evidence. "Eric Thompson," Sarah continued, displaying a photo of the injured driver from Detroit. "He could have died because we put him in a van with faulty brakes. How many more accidents are we willing to risk?" "This is all very dramatic." Maxwell attempted to regain control, "but these are isolated incidents." Jenny stepped forward, her tablet in hand. "I have 3 years of records proving otherwise. Every facility follows the same pattern. It's not isolated, it's institutional. The boardroom erupted in argument. Some members defended the current system, while others expressed horror at the revelations. Sarah let them argue for a moment before raising her hand for silence. I understand this is shocking. Our company has lost its way, but we have a choice now. We can either make this right, or we can face federal investigations, lawsuits, and the complete destruction of our reputation. She laid out her plan: immediate safety inspections of all vehicles, external audits of all facilities, new maintenance protocols, and a complete overhaul of the payment system. The cost would be significant, but the alternative was worse. You'll destroy our profit margins. Maxwell protested. No, Sarah countered, I'll stabilize them. Real margins, based on honest business practices, and Mr. Maxwell, consider this your notice of termination. Maxwell stood up, knocking his chair over. You can't do this. I built this system. Exactly, Sarah replied calmly. And now you'll answer for it. Security is waiting outside to escort you to a meeting with our legal team. As Maxwell was led out, Sarah turned to the remaining board members. I need unanimous support for these changes. Anyone who can't commit to fixing this should resign now. The room was silent for a long moment. Then, one by one, the board members nodded their agreement. 2 members stood and left, submitting their resignations on the spot. Maya? Sarah turned to her friend. I want you to head our new driver advisory board. Jenny, you'll lead corporate compliance. We need people who aren't afraid to speak the truth. As the meeting concluded, Sarah felt both exhausted and energized. The hard work was just beginning, but for the first time, Fast Track Logistics was on the right path. That evening, as she packed up her office, Sarah found a note from Maya. Thank you for listening to us, for seeing us as people, not just drivers. Sarah smiled, remembering her own days behind the wheel. The transformation wouldn't be easy, but with honest people like Maya and Jenny helping lead the way, she knew it was possible. What she didn't realize was that the next few months would test everyone's commitment to change, as they faced the challenges of rebuilding Fast Track from the ground up. 6 months after Sarah Chen's undercover mission, Fast Track Logistics had become a different company. The warehouse bustled with activity as she walked through, greeting drivers by name and stopping to check the newly installed safety boards. Maya, now Director of Driver Relations, was conducting a morning briefing. The drivers sat in new break room chairs, reviewing updated safety protocols on their new tablets. The atmosphere was focused but relaxed, no more rushed meetings or impossible quotas. Our driver retention is up 60%, Maya reported later in Sarah's office. The new fair wage system and realistic delivery schedules are making a huge difference. Sarah nodded, looking at the latest reports. The transition hadn't been easy. Several shareholders had initially revolted when profits dipped during the first month of reforms. But now, 3 quarters later, the company was showing stable, sustainable growth. Jenny appeared at the door with more good news. The federal investigation is officially closed. They're satisfied with our compliance measures and all the back pay has been distributed to affected drivers. The biggest change had been in company culture. Every vehicle now underwent weekly safety inspections. Drivers had proper break times and realistic routes. A new anonymous reporting system, managed by Jenny's team, ensured that concerns were addressed promptly. Remember Eric Thompson? Maya asked, smiling. He's returning to work next week. His doctor cleared him, and he specifically requested to come back. Eric's accident had become a turning point in Fast Track's history. The company had not only covered his medical expenses, but had also maintained his salary during recovery. His story was now part of their driver safety training program. Sarah walked to the window, watching the delivery vans leaving for their morning routes. Each one was properly maintained, equipped with new safety features, and operated by well-rested, fairly paid drivers. The shareholders' meeting is tomorrow, Thomas reminded her, entering with a stack of reports. They'll want to hear about the impact of all these changes. Sarah smiled. The numbers told a clear story. While profit margins were slightly lower, the company's reputation had soared. Customer satisfaction was at an all-time high, and their market share had actually increased as clients appreciated their commitment to ethical business practices. Later that day, Sarah visited the maintenance garage where the old van 483, the one that had crashed with Eric, was displayed as a reminder. Beside it hung the company's new motto: Safety first, people always. During the afternoon driver meeting, a new employee asked about the old days. Maya shared her story, not holding back about the challenges they had faced. Sarah watched from the back of the room, remembering her own days as a driver, feeling the ache in her muscles and the stress of impossible quotas. But that's not who we are anymore, Maya concluded. Now we're proof that a company can be successful while treating its workers right. The next morning, Sarah stood before the shareholders. Some of the faces were new, investors who believed in ethical business practices had bought out those who'd left during the changes. 6 months ago, we chose integrity over artificial profits, Sarah began. Today, I'm proud to show you the results. She presented the numbers. Lower turnover meant reduced training costs. Proper maintenance prevented expensive accidents. Happy drivers provided better service, leading to more customer referrals. The math was simple. Doing the right thing was actually good for business. After the meeting, Sarah found a small gathering in her office. Maya, Jenny, Thomas, and Eric Thompson stood around her desk. We wanted to give you something, Maya said, presenting a package. Inside was a framed collection of items: her old delivery uniform, her driver ID badge, and a photo of her first day as a driver. Below it was a simple message signed by hundreds of employees. Thank you for walking in our shoes. Sarah felt tears in her eyes as she hung the frame on her wall. The undercover CEO had become a symbol of the change they'd all worked for, but the real victory belonged to every person who'd helped transform Fast Track into a company they could be proud of. As she looked out at the setting sun, watching the last delivery vans return for the day, Sarah knew that their journey wasn't over. But Fast Track had found its true path, one where success was measured not just in profits, but in the well-being of every person who helped make those deliveries possible.